And excellent. So welcome again, everybody, to the inaugural lecture of the semester-long lecture series From the New Archaeology to Equitable Archaeologies, Global Lessons from Black Scholars. This series is hosted by the University of Michigan's Museum of Anthropological Archaeology and the Department of Anthropology. I'm Tim Everhart. I'm a PhD student here, and I'm coming to you virtually by way of the University of Michigan on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Wyandotte, Miami, Sauk, Fox, and others. And I do want to acknowledge the early and ongoing entanglements of the history of this university with Indigenous and Black communities. To quote the words of the historian Taya Miles, quote, "The University of Michigan was born out of a compromise made by Native people in the context of a century of colonial warfare and land dispossession in the Great Lakes. It was built on ill-gotten lands and funded from wealth derived from slave labor," end quote. With this, we'd like to recognize the 1817 Treaty at the foot of the rapids with the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and reaffirm their ancestral and contemporary ties to the land and the contributions of both Black and Indigenous peoples to this university. This speaker series grows out of the department and museum's responses to the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests of 2020. Anthropological archaeologists are, in general, well positioned to leverage the past to tell stories of dispossession and stories of empowerment, to identify longstanding structures of inequality and oppression, and to contextualize current social justice movements to help secure a just future for our society. Yet, within our community of scholars at UMA, little of our research speaks to the histories unfolding before our eyes and the histories that precipitated them. This speaker series, then, is an attempt to deliver the education this moment demands of us and that our university desperately needs. The title of this lecture series is in many ways self-referential to both the legacy of this museum and department and the future we hope to chart. Given the outsized role of our department and museum played in the formation of the so-called new archaeology, our legacy has become indelibly enmeshed with it. Here, I want to recall a comment made by Mark Leone in reviewing what is perhaps the most iconic volume of the new archaeology, of course, Sally and Lou Binford's New Perspectives in Archaeology, where he said in 1971, quote, "Suddenly, the new archaeology is everybody's archaeology," end quote. This lecture series is one of our initiatives working towards making this sentiment true, to become an institution that promotes and practices archaeologies by and for everybody. The faculty, students, and staff voted on a slate of speakers and collectively decided to invite 6 Black scholars whose research speaks to the topical, epistemological, and ontological diversity in archaeologies today. With all that said, I'm absolutely ecstatic to introduce to you Dr. Helina Woldekiros, an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. She's an Aksumite scholar and a leading expert on the archaeology of the Horn of Africa. Her work traces the effects of food production, agricultural diets, pastoralism, and mobility on the abilities of African societies to survive and prosper during a range of sometimes challenging ecological settings over the past 3,000 years. Today, her talk is titled Niche Economy, the Afar Salt Caravan Route, and the Political Economy of the Aksumite State, Ethiopia. This event is co-sponsored by the Interdepartmental Program in Classical Art and Archaeology, the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology, the Department of Middle East Studies, and the African Studies Center. And before turning things over, a few notes on the technology. First, viewers have the ability to turn live transcripts on and off. Throughout the lecture, you are welcome to utilize the Q&A function to both ask questions and to upvote the questions others have asked that you'd like to see answered. At the end of this lecture, we'll turn to those questions and I'll sort of host the Q&A. And with all that said, I'm ecstatic to turn things over to you, Dr. Woldekiros.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Tim, and for the invitation. I'm really excited to be able to contribute to this exciting new endeavor that the University of Michigan and everyone there are doing, and I'm really grateful and I really appreciate it. So today I'm going to talk about the research I did in the Northern Horn of Africa. And before I start discussing my research, I'll explain a few. So as an Aksumite scholar and caravan archaeologist, I'm mostly interested in studying ancient trade routes and trade networks. As you can see on the map in Africa, we know that long distance and local trade has contributed to the rise of this amazing different socioeconomic institutions, urban centers, city-states, rural settlements. Most of the studies look at the usual commodities like obsidian, gold, and some salt. But in all these studies, what is missing is that we only hear about the elite gaining prestige and power from these trade networks, but we never talk about the other participants, for example, mobile pastoralists, common people, middlemen, merchants. We have an array of participants in this vast continent, but we tend to focus mostly on the elite. And so my research really focuses on looking at not only the elite, but all the participants in this ancient trade. I follow salt, so I chose salt trade because for one, salt has been very instrumental not only in Africa, but globally in creating distinctive early complex societies. From extensive ethnoarchaeological research, we know that in Africa we have a very diverse salt production technology. So we know that there were different types of producers. As you can see in the picture, in places where there are rock salts, it's very easy to mine them. They're very visible on the surface. But in other places in Africa, for example, in tropical Africa, where there's no salt source, people have an innovative way of producing salt from specific plant species. They will burn them, process the ashes, and get the salt. So there's a very diverse way of producing salt in Africa. So the talk I will be giving today will mostly focus on areas where rock salt is transported. So in my research, again, I look at the long-term impact of salt trade in the socio-economic and political organization of early states in Africa, focusing on types of trade organization, types of labor, and also kind of power relationship between the different actors in this salt trade. Again, when we look at outside Africa, the presence of participants has been noted everywhere, including in the Maya region, the Andes, in Europe, Southwest Asia, and China. So it's not only in Africa that we see multiple participants, it's also very global. So coming to my project, in my project, I look at the role of salt trade in the Aksumite State and how it contributed to the different dynamics of state formation, but also the state's relationship with the other actors at the time. So I have 3 questions that I want to answer today by using my data that I collected on the Afar Salt Route. One is we will look at how the salt trade is organized today and in the past, and we will look at types of bureaucratic institutions that are involved. And then we will explore if there is unequal access to transport, technology, and production. And the way I'm going to do this, again, is by bringing in my ethnoarchaeological and research together. For me, in order to make sense of all the data, I use the concept of niche economy. And I will explain in this slide what niche economy is. I promise this is the only slide with a lot of writing. But for me, I use the niche economy as used or proposed by Jane Guyer. She is an American anthropologist, and she published this amazing book called An African Niche Economy, Farming to Feed Ibadan. And she was looking at Yoruba farmers in Nigeria and looking at their economic specialization. And what she realized is that these farmers, they have multiple ways of dealing with this dynamic or unpredictable environment. And previous, or for lack of a better word, Western economic models or capitalist economic models do not tend to fit very well with most pre-colonial and post-colonial African economic systems. And the usual neoclassical economic models disregard the uniqueness of the African economic system. So she proposed niche economy, and what she did is she actually turned upside down the dictionary meaning of niche economy. So niche is not created for people, but people create niches, and they go in and out of these niches. They can modify them. Sometimes the modification might even make these niches disappear. But the most important aspect of people who live in a niche economy kind of economic organization is that they thrive in times of instability and unpredictability. So if you live in a very dynamic environment where if you're relying on seasonal rainfall and there's no rain for 2 years and you cannot farm, then you have to have a backup economic system to survive, to support your family and your community. So this is the main reason that I use this niche economy concept, and we can come back to that when I discuss the data. And I'm sure most of you know who the Pre-Aksumite and Aksumites are, but I want to give you a little bit of culture history background. As you can see on the map, the ancient Aksumites were located in the Ethiopian and Eritrean Highlands. And during the time of the height of the empire, they extended their territory all the way to South Arabia, to Meroe in modern day Sudan, Somalia. So this is the time where we see tons of trading activity going on between the Aksumites and the outside world. The location of the Aksumites was very key for their success as a powerful state, because they had access to commodities and resources coming from the heart of Africa. And then they have commodities and resources being transported to the Eastern Mediterranean from the Indian Ocean and back. So you have people, different types of commodities passing by their ports. So they were positioned in a good way to take advantage of this thriving economy of the ancient world. We also have tons of Aksumite and Pre-Aksumite sites in Ethiopia and Eritrea that contributed to our understanding of who the Aksumites were. And these are some of the most important sites on the map, but there are hundreds being found every day. We're still exploring the Aksumite Empire. And this is just a brief chronology. I don't expect you to memorize this, but it will give you types of phase that archaeologists have come up with to differentiate the Aksumite and Pre-Aksumite period. And this is mostly based on ceramic and radiocarbon dating. And if you look at the top graph, it shows you that we're still exploring the Pre-Aksumite and Aksumite empire or states, settlements, and we're trying to revise chronology. So we're pushing it in both directions, making it more earlier and later. And the other important thing about the Aksumites is that they're considered as the earliest complex societies in sub-Saharan Africa. They were already engaged in writing systems. If you look at the right bottom picture, you have Ethiopic and Sabian languages written during the Pre-Aksumite period. And you can see on the left top, this huge building. It was a pre-Christian religious temple built almost 3,000 years ago. And again, this is the oldest standing building in sub-Saharan Africa outside Egypt. The Aksumites were also considered an important partner by the Romans, Persians, all the great contemporaneous empires of the time. They were building monumental architecture. They were building palaces, mansions, and this famous stele that you can see on the left side, which is a false door and false window story building, again, built almost 2,000 years ago. So, and this is one of the iconic features of the Aksumite Empire, but they were also minting coins from gold, silver, and copper, and extensive trading with the outside world. We also know a little bit about the social organization. Of course, they had a hierarchical system at the political center. They had a king, and immediate positions, administrative positions, were held by the king's family members. We also have priests, craftsmen, farmers, pastoralists, all sorts of people coexisting in this dynamic culture. We also know that the success of the Aksumites came from long and local distance trade routes. They also had an amazing agriculture, which I'll talk about later. But you can see on the graph that they were exporting different types of commodities outside the Horn of Africa, but they were importing tons of foreign goods, mostly geared toward the elite community. They were importing olive oil, Roman wine, all the way from the Mediterranean, and from India, spices and clothes. So it was a very thriving long distance trade for the Aksumites. The other thing we're finding more and more is that agriculture was also an important source of wealth for the Aksumites, especially the ox-drawn plow culture. Farming was very intensive in the highlands. About 85% of the population were farmers during the Aksumite times and even today. So farming is really great. And for those of you who had the chance to experience Ethiopian food, I'm sorry, it's lunchtime, I'm showing this, but most of the grains that we love were domesticated in the Ethiopian Highlands and the Eritrean Highlands. So again, agriculture was key. So that was just a brief background to the Aksumite culture history. Now I'm going to move on to talk about my project on the Afar Salt Caravan project. So in my project, I used a combined archaeological and ethnoarchaeological research and analysis. And I want to also introduce some of my group or team members. I'm really proud and happy to say they were all local scholars, local students from Aksum University and Addis Ababa University, and their teacher from Aksum University. So it was all Ethiopian crew. And you can see, you know, we were excavating at the site and you can see the modern day caravanners passing by the site. So this is an amazing field project. I'm really excited to share with you guys today. So it's a very vast area, very hard to cover in one lecture. And so these are some of my crew members. And finally, the caravanners and the salt miners were also an important part of this project. They contributed so much for this project. So moving on to talk about the ethnoarchaeological results. I want to start by introducing the Afar Salt Trade Route. Again, this trade route crosses two dynamic, completely different ecological zones. It starts from the Ethiopian highlands and goes all the way to the Afar lowlands, which is the hottest and harshest place in Africa. And the salt source in the Afar desert has been around for thousands of years and it never runs out. So every time people go there and mine it and come back next year, it's always, you know, reproducing salt for the caravanners. So this kind of interaction between these two areas would have been similar during the Aksumite period. And looking at the Ethiopian highlands, you can see that it's very green. Agriculture is the most important economic activity today, and it was the same in the past. Farmers rely on seasonal rainfall, but they don't have salt sources. So they have tons of livestock, plant diet, but they need salt. So they have to travel really far to the low deserts to get this important salt commodity. The Afar desert, on the other hand, is very dry. Like I mentioned, it's very arid. You cannot grow anything there, but there are still people who live there. They are mobile pastoralists or semi-mobile pastoralists. They rely on their cattle and camel herd, but they don't have agricultural products, so they have to go to the highlands to get those commodities. So this created some kind of motive for this kind of interaction between the highlanders and the lowlanders. So from my study, I was able to see who participates in the modern trade today. What I did is I rented my own camel caravan trail and joined the caravanners from the highlands. If you look at the map, the blue ones represent the three major passes that the Highland caravanners used to cross to the lowland desert. If you look at the brown line, this is where the Highlanders and the lowlanders merge together and continue their journey to the salt flat. So I did all of these journeys. These are the different colors represent different pathways to the salt flat. So that's me on the route, just to give you a context. So my finding shows that, again, not only the salt trade route traverses these two dynamic ecological zones, but the participants also come from two different regions, two different cultures. The Tigray come from the highland. They're Semitic speaking, considered mostly Christian population. They are farmers and they engage in the salt trade part of the year when they're not farming. And the lowlanders come from the Afar region, and they are considered Cushitic speakers. Cushitic language is the oldest language in Africa. They are considered Muslims. So you have these two different cultures, two different languages coming together to access the same resource. Even for both participants, they come from a specific town and region in their own community. Not everyone could be a caravaner. You have to have it inherited from your family. So it's a family skill that's inherited from father to son, from son to grandson. So again, this is a traditional skill that's been passed on from generation to generation. The caravanners are subsistence farmers. So most of the caravanners do not own their pack animals. They usually rent them from their own community there. So there are farmers who are not caravanners, but they breed donkeys and camels for this kind of work. So they make a profit by just staying at home and not doing the hard work. And all the pack animals are male because of the journey, because it's very strenuous. They don't want female pack animals to go there because it will not help them be very reproductive. So they don't want to put stress on the females, so they stay at home. And also the Highlanders mostly use donkeys and mules, while the lowlanders rely mostly on camels. So this is just a profile graph to show you the type of altitude that they cross with their pack animal, types of vegetation and climate they cross when they ascend from about 3,000 meters above sea level, and they continue down until they reach to minus 200 meters. So it's a very, very difficult journey. It's very hard if you're not used to it. And I took some pictures when I was walking with them to see, the change in the landscape. And you can see foggy highland. We were really super cold, cool, very nice air all the way until we get to the Afar Desert. This is the first point where we reached. And we're now in the low level, zero level below sea level. So it's really hot. You can't even breathe. It gets about 50 degrees Celsius at noon, so you have to stop walking and start later around 3 p.m. So again, this is just to give you the type of landscape the Afar Desert is in. So this is very close to the salt flats, so it's getting muddy and sandy when you get closer to the lake. And this is where the salt is. So this is where the mining and caravanning happens. I hope that gave you a nice background about the environment I was talking about. But the interesting thing is, going back to participants, is that it wasn't only the caravanners that were participating in the salt trade. There were also other stakeholders equally participating in the salt trade. And without all of them working together, it would not be possible. So you have warehouse owners who receive the caravanners commodity or load, and they give them space to store the salt. They buy it from them directly. So these warehouse owners are responsible for shipping all the salt to the highlands on portion of the route where road car travel or track travel is allowed. So you have shop owners participating in this trade. You have these women who make the water sack that the caravanners use. Without this water sack, it would be impossible again for the logistic of the caravanners. You have middlemen. And the other thing we see now is outside the caravanners today, in all the different stakeholding participants, there are women participating. So women do participate in the salt trade, not on the caravans today, but it would have been possible in the past. We also have residents of towns and villages providing logistics to the caravanners. They have coffee and tea makers at the salt flat making tea and coffee for the miners and the caravanners. And most importantly, the mining and cutting is done by a different group of people also coming from the highlands and lowlands. So there's a division of labor at the salt flat. It's traditionally accepted that the initial salt mining is done by the highlanders, and the standardized cutting of the salt into 3 different standards is done by the Afar miners. So again, very respectful of each other's labor division. The last participants on the salt trade are the tax collectors. So the tax pole is outside, as you can see. Early in the morning, all the caravanners line up to go to the salt flat. This is the last point before they reach the salt flat. And what the tax collectors do is they count the number of animals per group and charge them per animal. So camels and donkeys have different pricing. When you come back with the salt, you don't pay tax. Nobody asks you, to pay per stone block. You can have as many stone blocks as your animals can hold. There's no tax coming back. So this is how the tax system works today. So I'm sure most of the archaeologists, want to know what the material correlates of this modern day caravan route leaves. And I was able to identify at least 2 types of potential areas where tons of material accumulates from the pack travel traffic on the area and camping. So I saw that in areas where the caravanners camp for a long time, or the overnight campsites accumulate more material in the form of dung and personal utensils and utensils used for, keeping the animals groomed and things like that get incorporated into the sediment. And all of these campsites or overnight campsites are located near mobile pastoralist or agriculturalist villages. They don't live within the village. They are on the outskirts of the village. The villagers do not want strangers wandering in and destroying their settlements, but they do provide logistics for them, but they're not allowed to bring in their animals inside the settlement area. In terms of small scale finding sites used by caravanners for a very short time, there are tons of evidence like that. For example, animals die on the route and they never take the body back with them. They leave the animals to deflate on the ground. They also make bread. So the caravanners' diet is predominantly bread, sugar, coffee. They don't have time to slaughter animals and eat them. So what they do is when they need protein, they eat it, they get it from the logistical support that's found along the way from these villages. So these are some of the activities that leave short-term material signature. The other place I saw that leaves material signature is a ritual place. Again, these are people who have their own religion. The picture on the top, the rock circle, was created by the Muslim caravanners for their daily prayer. The one at the bottom is the last pass before you reach the salt flat. You can see the rock shelter or the rock outcropping. Here, both the Christian and the mobile pastoralists throw pebbles inside that rock for good luck. And so I was working with them, and I was the only stranger, and I was going to pass without throwing the pebble, and everyone was screaming, you know, you will ruin our journey, so you have to do it. So I have to throw one pebble inside. So you have to be a good football player to make it land in there. So that's the ethnoarchaeological result. Now I'm going to move on to talk about the archaeological result. So as you can imagine, after I completed the ethnoarchaeological project, I went back to St. Louis and created a model for me to use to go back and survey for potential sites. What I did is I used the GPS points that I collected when I was working with the caravanners, and I tried to use the very well-known Aksumite and Pre-Aksumite sites as a proxy, and try to calculate a list cost analysis on the trail. And what I found is that on portion of the route, the caravanners follow the least costly path, the practical path that is favorable for four-legged animals. So it's very hard to walk especially for donkeys and camels in high steep areas that humans usually can do. So they have to look for paths that are practical. So that a portion of it was well compatible with the GIS model, but half of the trade route, especially the one starting in the lowland, people were following places where there are good social relationships, where they can get logistical support, protection from carnivores and looters. So again, this is something to think about when we think about methodology. But this exercise also helped me to identify areas where I should be focusing on survey and excavation. And to my great surprise, when we went back and did the survey and archaeological investigation, we were able to find so many towns, 2 previously unknown towns on the trade route, settlements, artifacts, scatter, campsites, all along the trade route, about 500 meters from the modern day trade route. So this is an exciting finding, and the excavation we did included 3 types of sites. We have caravan campsites, Aksumite church ruins, and settlement sites. So the Aksumites' desire to access salt to the Afar region really created this opportunity for different types of towns and settlements to emerge along the trade route. And what I saw is that there were at least 2 types of towns. You have the mid-altitude towns where there's plenty of food, there's place for trading and exchange with other communities. It's a good settled area for even for having storage for salt and things like that. And then you have this ecotonal areas or towns located in transition zones that were there for just this to support this logistics and nothing else, because there is no resource around that area. So it's not a very wealthy area to be living in unless you're there, you know, to be part of this trade network. So just to show you pictures of some of the excavation and the strategic location of these different sites. So if you can see on the top left corner, you see, you know, Aksumite churches. So why are the Aksumite churches central to the salt trade is that usually we find Aksumite churches in very high to reach areas, very on mountain tops, very hard to see. But these church ruins that we found were located right where the salt caravan passes in the valley, in the floodplains, in the low area where it's visible from all directions. The other thing we saw was the trade route follows closely to local rivers in all the towns we've seen. And the caravan campsites are found in the floodplains. They're still being farmed, but we were able to excavate some of them. And then we found settlement ruins like this on the side where the caravanners were coming back. Again, I will discuss more about our findings about this. Of course, we were finding plants and animals, but it varied from site to site. For example, the caravan campsites, they did not have any food remains. They had a few plant remains like wheat and barley, probably used for bread making. The meat consumption was mostly happening in the church sites and the settlement sites. So the caravan campsites did not have a lot of meat evidence in them. The other great finding for us in terms of looking at regional participation is the pottery. So Aksumite and Pre-Aksumite pottery are well studied, and we know which pottery comes from which time period and which area. So this was also helpful. We found potteries, especially bowls and cups, are used. We also found braid making stone, which is very similar to the one the modern day caravanners are using in the excavation. And the other thing we found, again, in terms of talking about regional participation, is obsidian. To date, we have not found any obsidian source for Pre-Aksumite and Aksumite sites in the highlands, but we do have obsidian source in the low desert in the Afar region. And it is possible that even before the salt trade started, obsidian trade was already happening between this highland and lowland regions. So those are my data. I'm sorry I dumped a lot of data on you, but I will try to bring all of them together by discussing the larger issues and what they mean. So I will start by talking about how the salt trade was organized in the Aksumite period and how the ethnoarchaeology and the archaeology together can help us understand this. So today in northern Ethiopia, there are at least 7 types of economic strategies being practiced, because again, it's a dynamic environment. People need to specialize in different activities, and caravan salt trade just forms one of them. So they engage in different activities throughout the year. Excuse me, so one thing I didn't mention is that this economic strategies, again, could be affected by external and internal variables. Internal variables could be, access to pack animals, loss of, land and things like that within the economic system can affect any of these economic strategies. But there are also external variables that can affect the economic strategy. For example, if there's war or drought or famine or pandemic like we're in today. So one of the things about people living in niche economies is that they can endure and thrive even if there is pandemic like COVID. I'm sorry to say that, I have to bring in COVID. So the second question is, looking at the archaeological record, are there any visible signs of unequal access to transport and technology, salt production and distribution? Again, going back to the ethnoarchaeological record, today we know that there are different participants in the salt trade. The salt caravanners are subsistence farmers and mobile pastoralists, so they participate in this trade at a subsistence level. They don't participate in it to make profit. But the other participants, even the ones that rent out their animals, they make profit. The middlemen, the shop owners, everyone makes profit from this trade. So everyone participates in the trade to make profit. And the nice thing about the niche economy concept is that it's very focused on producers and production and not the market. So it doesn't matter what the market is doing. What matters is what the producers and production is doing to resist this unpredictable environment. So this scenario might have been possible during the Aksumite period, but it would have been even more different than today. And moving on to look at if there was any kind of state involvement in the salt trade during the Aksumite period, we have to look deep into the archaeological record. So during our excavation in those 2 different towns I mentioned, we found that in the ecotonal areas, the structure compared to other known Aksumite sites is considered a domestic non-elite structure. The presence of the church, on the other hand, on the salt route shows that it's possible that the state was collecting tax through the church. So we know that during the Aksumite period, the church and the state had parallel powers. So it's possible that indirectly state involvement, directly there are tons of independent towns far away from the center of participating in the salt trade. So looking at power relationship and centralization of the economy and the organization of subsistence economies independent of the state, what can we say about the Aksumite salt trade and its role in the economic organization? So I argue that because of the location of the salt source in a very harsh environment, it required participation of different social groups, individuals, and institutions. For all of them, of course, the logistical investment is really high. So in terms of participation, again, the state would have participated by collecting tax or even providing protection on the route for merchants coming from the highlands. The non-elite small-scale traders or farmers would have participated in the trade to provide salt to areas that are really remote, very hard to reach areas in their own communities and towns, villages where the state does not have any reach at all. And then you'll have an elite or rich merchant class coming from the highlands to provide the demand in the urban centers in the market. So the state cannot provide the marketplace everywhere. So you need middlemen and merchant class to provide this logistic and trade. So there is room for participation for everyone in different ways. And because of the landscape and environment, it's possible for different groups to participate, and as the archaeology is showing and the ethnoarchaeology is showing. So to conclude, again, this project, in addition to providing the first radiocarbon dating for the Afar Salt Trade route, it shows the cooperative relationship within and among networks, the presence of horizontal and vertical power relationships. I did not go deep into the types of political organization during the Aksumite period, but there are different types of segmentary states around the Aksumites. Today, there are 86 ethnic groups, culture groups in the Ethiopian Highlands, and the Aksumites form one of them, or the Highlanders or the Semitic speakers are one of them. So we have really good historical record to show the coexistence of other segmentary states during this time. Again, this is a project that can continue being done for future generations, and I intend to continue working on this particular project. I will, of course, be happy to answer more questions. Just, the takeaway is that in order to look at ancient trade routes in Africa or anywhere, it's very important to look at or explore different economic models, but also research methodologies, and also look at types of power relationship they had through time. So with that, I conclude my talk, and thank you everyone for being patient with me. I want to acknowledge my funding agencies, starting from Washington University, the National Science Foundation, Fulbright Hays, the Winner Grant Foundation, and the ARCCH office who permits our research grant in Ethiopia. And finally, again, I want to thank all the salt traders who really contributed to this knowledge. So with that, I will turn the table to the organizers and for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Woldekiros, for that just amazing talk. We do have a couple of questions that have come in here to start. The first one is by Jordan Dalton, or Dr. Jordan Dalton, I should say. What types of evidence do archaeologists use to discuss Aksumite taxation? Did the ethnoarchaeological research influence how you thought about the Aksumite taxation systems? Or rather, how those taxation systems might have worked?
So that's a good question. So for the Aksumite period, we have different types of textual information. So the good thing about working at Aksumite sites is that they had their own writing system. So they were writing things in inscriptions about use of salt to pay soldiers or farmers and things like that. And then we have external travelers coming to the Aksumite empire or state during that time. For example, most of the data about the salt trade for the Aksumite period comes from writing by Cosmos Indicoplistus, a Greek monk who came to Ethiopia. So these informations are bits and pieces about the economic system or taxation for the Aksumite period, but we do have the Aksumite inscription and all these documents telling us that salt was used as a payment or as tax collection. Most of the writings that I use come from later in time. There they talk about, for example, one of the towns that I excavated, which is the Agula town, the king collecting tax through the church from the caravanners coming from the highlands. But he was collecting tax from only the highlanders, not the lowlanders. So for me, because anyone who studies salt, it's very hard to find evidence for salt presence because it melts, as you know. But I used this proxy data looking at these towns and settlements and villages and create a hypothesis that the church was there probably to tax the caravanners coming back to the highlands. And this would have changed through time because different kings had different philosophy. Things changed through time. For example, in the 17th century, we have a writing where there was a conflict between the highland and lowland caravanners. So what the king did was he sent all the Christian caravanners during the Muslim fasting season, saying, Muslims will not attack, during their fasting season. He also made sure that women and children went with the caravanners because he said, women and children are not attacked, by Muslims. So all this information, historical information from all the way from the Aksumite period to medieval, and then the Ethnoarchaeology shows us that, salt was an important form of exchange system. We have tons of information about the Aksumites using salt bars to pay for some things for exchange. Even though they're minting coin, they were also using salt bars. So these are some of the proxy evidence that I use to talk about how they use the salt for taxation system or how tax was collected. I hope that answers your question, but I'll be happy to answer more follow-up question.
Excellent.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
No, I think this is fine in case you need to flip back
Okay.
to answer a question here. Joyce Marcus asks, are there other items other than salt that move along the same route?
Yes, so that's a really good question. And like I mentioned, obsidian is found only in the Afar Desert. So we know that from the Afar, obsidian and salt was coming to the highlands. But from the highlands, it's mostly agricultural products, wheat, barley, sorghum, that the mobile pastoralists need. So they exchange the salt for this kind of commodity. And the Afar also use salt trade from that to buy regular utensils, again from the highlands, or they go to Djibouti, neighboring low desert region, to buy household goods. So that's how modern day traders do it. But in the archaeological record, we have obsidian from the Afar starting from the Pre-Aksumite period. Yeah.
Great. Hannah Hoover asks, have you observed any changes in participation and economic organization of the salt trade within the Aksumite Empire versus the salt trade today within a different political system?
Yeah, so so the salt trade was very different at different time periods. So during the Aksumite period, we know that caravanners were bringing salt all the way to the highland markets. Today, the caravanners are allowed to transport salt using pack caravans at a specific point, right at the intersection between the highland and lowland, because in 1992, the government decided that they don't want these caravanners coming in the city. And these caravanners, they have like 6,000 animals at the same time, and you can imagine types of dung accumulation in the city. So to avoid that, they stopped them from coming all the way to the highlands. So during the Aksumite period, from Cosmos and other information, they were saying the Danakil people came with their camels with salt in the highlands in the Aksumite king's territory. In medieval time, like I said, organization was very different. The different emperors used different strategies. There were times in the 16th century where the royal family organized their own caravans to go to the salt flat to get salt, side by side with the traditional farmers and mobile pastoralists who continued to transport salt to their own rural areas and villages where the state is not involved. Even up to the 19th century, the small-scale farmers and herders were responsible for providing salt for the rural areas. And the Ethiopian highlands, transport is really difficult because it's a steep highland plateau. It's a nightmare. So you need, caravanners to do that. And again, the state cannot organize this large-scale kind of distribution. The state mostly focused on providing provision in urban areas in the highlands. So I hope that answers your question.
No, I think it does. That's really fascinating, actually. Brian Stewart asks, or first he says, many thanks for the fascinating talk. Following up on Joyce's question, do you suspect that the salt traders took advantage of their middleman position to funnel other goods into the Highland Kingdom, for example, from the Indian Ocean or classical Mediterranean exchange worlds?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Again, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that the Aksumites were using caravans to also get other goods from deep into southern Ethiopia. For example, they were getting gold to export to the Mediterranean world. So they always hire a middleman in charge of the caravans to go with them and get the commodity that they need. So they were sending caravans in every direction, to Nubia, to Sudan, South Ethiopia, to Somalia, and then getting all the African commodities for export back to the Red Sea and Indian Ocean world. And we know that this pack caravan tradition has started really earlier on. As a zooarchaeologist, I have to mention that donkeys were domesticated in Northeast Africa. The wild ancestors of domestic donkeys are now found in Ethiopia and Eritrea. So even before camels came in, donkeys were doing a lot of caravan work for thousands of years, and not only carrying salt, but other commodities that the ancient Aksumites needed for their famous trade routes. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Yeah. Samar Ali asks, first says, very interesting talk. Then asks, any evidence of verbal art associated with salt mining culture?
Yeah, this is a nice question, and it's really, this is something I'm trying to find and looking forward to in the art and inscription, especially far in the areas, the sites that I was finding very far away from the center of the Aksumite Empire. It would be great to find this art and inscriptions. So far, we have not found anything, but there's one site one town that I found, which is very interesting. It has steel lace, not like the fancy dressed ones that we see up in the highlands, but this is a plain one, and it's right at the transition zone. So my hope is when I go back, hopefully pending COVID and funding, that there we'll find something in terms of inscription or art related with the salt trade. But we do have tons of depictions of camels and donkeys in pre-Aksumite and Aksumite rock art. They're everywhere. They are depicted everywhere. They have even depictions of mules when horses came. So the rock art sites are also another area that I'm planning to explore. But thank you for the question.
Okay. James Sneed asks, can you tell us a bit about the route itself? Is there any associated infrastructure, or is it essentially an unimproved track?
Yes, and this is a good question. This person must be studying caravan routes. So there are different types of caravan routes, in the world. And one thing about the Afar Caravan Route is that, it's a rocky desert. So the highland part is, clay soil, many years or ancient trade routes. If you look at them from the satellite image, is where they're very visible. So if you look at the Andes or other parts of the world, pack caravans leave ancient trails. So it changes the soil color. So there's no road infrastructure made for this trade route like the Romans or the Chinese trade routes. This is just natural trade route created through time by pack and human traffic. So there's no infrastructure. The only infrastructure is this towns and logistical points where people can get access to food and water. Other than that, I've been to the Atacama Desert. They were living this beautiful geoglyphs on the mountain dunes and rock cranes, like in the Egyptian desert, in the Western desert, in the famous Abu Balis Trail. They were keeping like pottery depots and food sponsored by the state throughout the 400-kilometer trade route. But we did not find anything like that. So again, that's why I'm confident to say that this is not the only one controlling this trade network. So yes.
Excellent. Raymond Silverman asks, or first says, fascinating talk, then asks, has there been any research regarding other trade routes? For instance, the routes that connected Adulis and the capital of Aksum. If so, what are the similarities and differences between such routes and the ones you've been studying?
So in terms of looking at the trade route, and I should have mentioned, most of the map I showed you earlier showed, the known Aksumite towns and settlements, and they're all strategically located along the long distance trade route, which goes all the way to Adulis, the famous port of the Pre-Aksumites and Aksumites. So in terms of radiocarbon dating this trade route, there has not been anything done like that, only using, the towns along the way, like, towns found Yeha, Beta Samaati, and, other sites, Kohaito, all of them, they are towns and settlements along the trade route. So we can use the date from them to date the actual activity. And we also have tons of Roman, Mediterranean, Indian, all sorts of artifacts found in all these towns and cities that I talk about. So those are again evidence for trade between the Aksumites and the outside world. In terms of list cost analysis, there's one publication done by Michael Harwar and Kathy Deandra, who are my colleagues. They've published a list cost analysis looking at the trade route from known Aksumite sites all the way to Adulis, and they came, with the same conclusion. You cannot use, list cost paths to argue for, trade routes, because there's always that social component on the ground that forces people to, take a different route, even though it's a practical route from a GIS point of view. You need good social relationships to pass through stranger towns. So those things affect the trade routes. So I hope that answers your question. That's a long answer to your question.
Okay, I think we'll ask one or two more here. We've got one by John Woodford. Did you determine what quantity of salt was equated to what amounts of other commodities, including money? Did the value change over time? And if so, what factors influenced change in value?
So this is a good question. Are you asking for the Aksumite period or the modern caravans in terms of change in value of the salt?
It doesn't specify, but
Okay.
I guess I'm assuming the Aksumite period.
Great. So for the Aksumite period, it's very hard to tell the value of salt compared to commodities. The only thing we can say is what they were trading salt for. So we have evidence, for example, the Aksumite using salt to trade for gold and meat. So these are, important, of course, in terms of time and context commodities. So they were using it to trade for everything. But in terms of what bar of salt equates with, what gram of gold, we don't have that quantitative data, unfortunately. If we do find, Aksumite inscriptions that speak to this in the future, that would be great. But for the Aksumite period, it's hard to tell the value of the salt versus the other commodities. For medieval Ethiopia, we have other kinds of coins being used. For example, during the 18th century, the Maria Teresa was being used. So salt bars today are cut into 3 standard sizes. When they go to the highland, they are further divided into smaller sizes. So we have, pricing for each size and even to the smallest portion. For medieval time, we know that the amole salt, which is like 5 centimeters, was equal to maybe that times 10 Ethiopian birr. So again, depending on which time period you are, it becomes more clear. Unfortunately, I cannot give you the exact value of the Aksumite period per other precious commodities.
Great. And last question here. Abigail Reek, first, thanks you for your great talk, and then asks, is there any evidence of conflict along the route, particularly between the differing religious groups meeting along the way?
Yeah, so today there's no conflict between those two groups. Again, it's amazing that they get along very well. They respect each other's territories, and the Highlanders are coming into a new territory. They respect the rules and regulations of each pastoralist town. They always, talk with the elder of the town. He will, give them hours, time, to settle in that outskirt of town, for provision and things like that. So there are no conflicts today. But like I mentioned, I was answering another question earlier. During medieval time, there was conflict between those two groups, which was mediated again by the Highland Emperor, who sent the caravanners during the Muslim fasting season. So again, it's possible that there was conflict even in the Aksumite period and people went around it, but there's no way to survive without salt in the highlands. So you have to have really good relationship along the route. And the salt trade is very seasonal. So the miners and caravanners do not go to the salt flat all year round. In the summer season, there's no salt mining because it gets flooded. So people accumulate salt for times when they're not going to the salt flat. So if there are conflicts, they will tap into their reserve during time of conflict and then start peaceful negotiation when it's time to go back again to the salt flat.
Thank you. And thanks again for such a fascinating talk, Dr. Woldekiros. It's unfortunate with the technology that we can't give you the sort of well-deserved round of applause.
No, thank you.
Yeah, and I do want to mention just before we leave here that we'll be back for the series on February 1st with Dr. Justin Dunovit on a talk titled A Historical Ecology of Slavery in the Danish West Indies, an Archaeology of Redress. So thanks everybody for tuning out today.
Thank you everyone for coming, and I enjoyed the questions. I really appreciated them.